Speed up the inheritance paperwork before she changes her mind, my daughter-in-law whispered beside my husband's coffin, thinking I was too lost in grief to hear her. My son didn't stop her. He just lowered his eyes and adjusted his black tie as if they were discussing weather instead of my life. I stood 3 feet away from Charles's casket, my gloved hand resting against the polished mahogany, and for the first time in 41 years of marriage, I realized I had never truly understood the people standing beside me. I'm Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and 3 days ago, I buried my husband. The funeral home smelled faintly of lilies and furniture polish, the same sterile sweetness every funeral parlor in America seems to carry. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers while guests moved quietly between rows of framed photographs from Charles's life. There he was at 23 in his Navy uniform. At 38 holding Nathan on his shoulders at Cape Cod. At 65 standing proudly beside the rose garden he spent an entire summer planting behind our Connecticut home. People kept telling me how beautiful the service was. Beautiful. Such a strange word for a room built around loss. I stood near the front greeting distant relatives and old business associates, while Vanessa floated gracefully through the crowd in a fitted black dress, touching arms, offering tissues, accepting sympathy like she was born for tragedy. If someone had looked at her from across the room, they would have seen the perfect daughter-in-law. Calm, elegant, devoted. But grief reveals things people normally hide. Tiny cracks, careless words, coldness in the eyes that appears for half a second too long. I noticed all of it now. Your mother should consider downsizing after this. Vanessa quietly told one of Charles's golfing friends while pretending to smile at me across the room. That house is much too large for one woman. One woman. Not Eleanor. Not family. Just one woman. Nathan spent most of the afternoon avoiding my gaze. My son had Charles's eyes, but none of his steadiness. At 42, he still folded under pressure the same way he had as a teenager. Vanessa spoke. Nathan followed. That had become the rhythm of their marriage years ago. I simply hadn't wanted to admit it. The pastor had barely finished his final prayer when I stepped into the side hallway for a moment alone. My feet ached in my low heels, and the weight of condolences from strangers felt heavier than grief itself. That was when I heard Vanessa's voice drifting from the room beside the chapel. The realtor said if we move quickly, we can probably list the property before fall. I froze beside the doorway. Vanessa, Nathan muttered nervously. Not here. Relax, she whispered sharply. Your mother can barely process what's happening right now. We need to speed up the inheritance paperwork before she starts getting emotional about the house. Emotional about the house. The house Charles and I bought in 1987 after saving for nearly 12 years. The house where Nathan learned to walk. The house where I held my husband's hand through chemotherapy treatments only 6 months earlier. I waited for Nathan to defend me, to say something, anything. Instead, all I heard was a long silence followed by the sound of his exhale. I know, he finally said quietly. Just give her some time. Vanessa sighed impatiently. Time is exactly what we don't have. My chest tightened, but strangely, I didn't cry. Not then. Something colder settled over me instead. A stillness so deep it almost frightened me. I looked down at my wedding ring. The diamond Charles picked himself in 1979 from a tiny jeweler in Boston because he said the larger stores felt impersonal. Charles used to tell me that character reveals itself fastest when money and death enter the same room. At the time, I thought he was being cynical. Standing there outside that funeral parlor office while my daughter-in-law discussed my future like a delayed real estate transaction, I realized he had simply been right. I straightened my black coat, lifted my chin, and walked calmly back into the chapel before they noticed I had heard everything. Vanessa appeared a few seconds later with the same polished smile still fixed on her face. Eleanor, she said sweetly, touching my arm lightly, people are asking, where you'd like the flower arrangements sent afterward. I looked directly into her eyes for the first time all day. She smiled wider, but something uncertain flickered behind it. Fear, maybe. Or guilt. I couldn't tell yet. Send the roses home, I said softly. Charles would have wanted that. Then I turned away before she could answer because suddenly I understood something very clearly. My husband's funeral was not the beginning of my loneliness. It was the beginning of the truth. The house felt unfamiliar without Charles in it. That surprised me more than the silence. We had lived there for nearly 4 decades, long enough for every staircase creak and every kitchen cabinet hinged to become part of the rhythm of our marriage. Yet when I unlocked the front door after the funeral and stepped inside alone, the rooms no longer felt warm. They felt paused, frozen somewhere between memory and absence. The faint smell of coffee still lingered in the kitchen because Charles had brewed a pot every morning at exactly 6:30 for as long as I could remember. His favorite navy sweater was still folded over the back of the dining room chair, where he left it the week before he passed. Reading glasses rested beside the newspaper on the breakfast table, one unfinished crossword puzzle waiting quietly for answers that would never come. I stood there in my black coat for several seconds without moving. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked loudly through the empty house. Tick, tick, tick. I used to find the sound comforting. Now it felt like something counting down. Outside, late October rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the backyard garden. Charles loved rainy afternoons. He always said the roses looked richer after a storm. I placed the funeral flowers carefully on the kitchen counter and removed my gloves one finger at a time. My wedding ring felt heavier than usual. For 41 years, I had never taken it off except once during surgery in 1998. I caught myself glancing toward the den, expecting Charles to appear in his brown leather chair with a blanket folded over his knees and a history documentary playing too loudly on television. Instead, the room remained dark and still. Grief does strange things to the mind. It keeps asking reality to change itself. Upstairs, I heard footsteps moving through the hallway. Vanessa and Nathan had arrived 10 minutes earlier behind me, carrying casserole dishes from church members and speaking in those overly careful voices people use around the recently widowed. "You should sit down, Mom," Nathan had said while avoiding eye contact. "You have had a long day." But neither of them sat. They wandered. Vanessa moved slowly through the house like someone inspecting a property before purchase. Her hand brushed across the marble kitchen island. She paused beside the dining room windows. She opened cabinets under the excuse of putting things away. Small things. Tiny things. Yet suddenly I noticed every one of them. "This place is probably worth over $2 million now," she said casually from the hallway. "Property values around here have gone crazy." Nathan muttered something too quietly for me to hear. I walked into the living room and lowered myself onto the sofa Charles bought 15 years ago after insisting the old one was ruining my posture. A folded throw blanket still rested exactly where he used to keep it beside him every evening. I picked it up slowly and pressed it against my chest for a moment before setting it back down. Upstairs, drawers opened and closed. Closet doors slid along tracks. I frowned slightly. "What are they doing?" I whispered to myself. A few minutes later, Vanessa appeared carrying an armful of Charles's jackets. "I thought maybe we could start organizing some things early," she said brightly. "You know, to make things easier later." Easier later. The phrase settled heavily in my stomach. "Put those back?" I said quietly. She blinked, almost surprised. "Oh, of course. I was only trying to help." Her smile remained perfectly polite, but something sharp flashed underneath it for half a second before disappearing again. Nathan finally walked into the room with his hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. He looked exhausted, though whether from grief or tension I could not tell anymore. "Vanessa means well, Mom," he said softly. "There is just going to be a lot to handle over the next few months." Months. The word echoed strangely because earlier that afternoon I had overheard them speaking as if my entire future needed to be settled immediately. I looked at my son carefully. He had dark circles under his eyes and the same nervous habit of rubbing his thumb against his wedding band whenever he felt trapped. Charles used to say Nathan hated conflict so much that eventually he would surrender to whoever created the most pressure. At the time, I thought he was being unfair. Sitting there in my silent living room while my daughter-in-law carried my husband's belongings through the house less than 3 hours after the funeral, I realized Charles had seen things long before I did. "I am tired," I finally said. "I think I would like to be alone tonight." Vanessa opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but Nathan touched her arm gently. "We should go," he said. She forced another smile toward me. "Call us if you need anything." I nodded without answering. After the front door closed behind them, the silence returned immediately. Real silence this time. Heavy. Honest. I walked slowly upstairs to the bedroom Charles and I had shared for most of our adult lives. His side of the bed was still slightly indented. A glass of water remained on his nightstand beside the lamp. I sat carefully on the edge of the mattress and looked around the room until my eyes landed on the small framed photograph near the dresser. It was taken on our anniversary trip to Maine 12 years earlier. Charles had his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing at something outside the camera frame. For the first time all day, tears finally filled my eyes. But underneath the grief, another feeling had started growing quietly inside me. Suspicion. And once suspicion enters a family, every memory begins to look different. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise because grief does not believe in sleep. For 41 years, Charles had been the first person awake in the house. He always moved quietly downstairs around 6:30, careful not to wake me, though the smell of coffee usually drifted into the bedroom before 7. That morning there was no coffee, no footsteps, no soft hum of the radio playing old jazz from the kitchen counter. Just silence stretching through every room like fog. I wrapped my robe tightly around myself and walked downstairs slowly, one hand sliding along the polished oak banister Charles refinished himself during the winter of 2004. Outside, the backyard lawn was wet from overnight rain, and the maple trees along the property line had started turning deep shades of orange and gold. Charles loved New England in October. He used to stand at the kitchen window every autumn morning and say the trees looked like they were trying too hard to impress someone. I reached the bottom step and stopped immediately. The alarm panel beside the front door glowed blue. The code had been changed. At first, I thought I was mistaken. Charles and I had used the same 4 numbers for years, Nathan's birthday. I typed them in carefully. Error. I frowned and tried again. Error. A cold feeling settled low in my stomach. I stared at the screen for several seconds before hearing movement behind me. Vanessa walked into the hallway dressed in cream-colored workout clothes, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek ponytail, like she had somewhere important to be instead of mourning her father-in-law. "Oh," she said lightly when she saw me standing there. "I forgot to mention, I updated the security settings last night." I turned toward her slowly. "You changed the alarm code?" "Just temporarily," she replied with a quick smile. "You have had a lot on your mind, Eleanor. I figured it was safer this way." Safer. The word echoed strangely in my ears. "What is the new code?" Her smile tightened slightly. "Nathan has it." Then she walked past me into the kitchen and began unloading green juice bottles from an insulated tote bag, like we were discussing weather instead of access to my own home. A few minutes later, Nathan came downstairs wearing the same wrinkled clothes from yesterday. He looked exhausted. "Morning, Mom," he muttered quietly. I kept my eyes on him. Why was the alarm code changed without asking me? He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Vanessa thought it would be a good idea with so many people coming and going after the funeral. "This is still my house." The words came out calmer than I expected. Nathan immediately looked uncomfortable. Vanessa opened the refrigerator door behind him and spoke before he could answer. "Nobody is saying it is not your house, Eleanor." But something about the way she said your house made it sound temporary, like a phrase people use before lawyers become involved. I walked into the kitchen and noticed several folders spread across the marble island countertop. Real estate brochures, assisted living pamphlets, market analysis reports. My eyes paused on a photograph of a modern condominium overlooking Stamford Harbor. "What is all this?" I asked quietly. Vanessa did not even flinch. "Just information," she said smoothly. "Nathan and I were talking last night. We think you deserve a simpler lifestyle after everything you have been through." Simpler lifestyle. Another polished phrase designed to sound caring while meaning something colder underneath. "I have lived here since 1987, I replied. "Nothing about this house feels complicated to me." Nathan shifted uncomfortably beside the coffee maker. "Mom, nobody wants to pressure you." I looked at him carefully. "Then why does it already feel like I am being removed from my own life?" Silence filled the kitchen instantly. Outside, rainwater dripped steadily from the gutters. Vanessa closed one of the folders calmly and folded her manicured hands together. "You are emotional right now," she said gently, "which is completely understandable." There it was. The same tone people use with elderly relatives when they want disagreement to sound like confusion. I suddenly remembered something small from 2 years earlier. Charles had forgotten his phone at home before a doctor appointment, so I drove to the medical center to bring it to him. When I arrived, I overheard Vanessa in the waiting room speaking quietly to Nathan. "Your mother is getting more forgetful," she had whispered. "You need to start preparing for what comes next." At the time, I dismissed it as concern. Standing in my own kitchen now, while she casually rearranged my future around me, I realized it had never been concern at all. It had been preparation. Vanessa gathered the folders neatly into a stack and smiled at me again, perfectly composed. "Nobody is making decisions today," she said. "We are just trying to help." Then her phone buzzed against the countertop. She glanced at the screen and answered immediately. "Hi, Rachel," she said brightly. "Yes, we are still discussing timing for the listing." Listing. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. Something inside me was changing. The grief was still there, heavy and sharp, but underneath it another instinct had started waking up quietly. Awareness. I looked toward the hallway where Charles's portrait still hung above the entry table beside a silver bowl for car keys. His expression in the photograph looked calm, certain somehow. And for the first time since the funeral, I began to wonder whether my husband had known exactly who Vanessa really was long before I did. That afternoon, after Vanessa left for what she called an important appointment and Nathan disappeared into Charles's old home office with his laptop, I wandered slowly through the house, trying to understand why every memory suddenly felt different. Grief changes the shape of the past. Moments that once seemed harmless begin revealing sharp edges you never noticed before. I stopped in the hallway outside Charles's study and rested my hand against the closed door. For years, that room had been his sanctuary. Dark walnut shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with history books, business journals, and leather binders from projects he refused to throw away. Even after retirement, Charles spent hours in there every evening reading under the soft yellow glow of his desk lamp, while classical music played quietly from an old radio near the window. I pushed the door open slowly. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and coffee. His glasses still rested beside a yellow legal pad covered in neat handwriting. I sat carefully in the chair across from his desk and looked around in silence. Then the memories started coming back one by one. Small things. Things I ignored because I trusted my family. About 3 years earlier, during Thanksgiving dinner, Vanessa had laughed lightly while helping clear plates from the table. "This house must be exhausting to maintain," she had said casually. "I cannot imagine wanting this much space at your age." At the time, Charles looked up sharply from his wine glass. "Your mother loves this house," he replied before I could answer. His tone had been calm, but firm enough to end the conversation immediately. Another memory surfaced from the following spring. Vanessa had insisted on hiring a property appraiser after a storm damaged part of the back fence. "It is important to know what the home is worth these days," she explained cheerfully. I remembered laughing awkwardly and saying she sounded more interested in the house than the family living inside it. Vanessa smiled at the time, but Charles did not. Later that evening, while we washed dishes together, he quietly asked me, "Do you ever feel like Vanessa studies people instead of loving them?" I dismissed the comment immediately. "Charles," I said back then, "you are being too suspicious." He did not argue. Charles rarely argued when he believed time would eventually prove his point. Sitting alone in his office now, I felt shame creeping slowly through my chest. Not because I had trusted Vanessa, but because I had ignored my husband when he tried to protect me. I opened the center desk drawer absent-mindedly and found a stack of handwritten birthday cards tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Every card Charles ever gave me. Anniversary notes, vacation postcards, tiny handwritten reminders tucked inside envelopes. One card from our 35th anniversary caught my attention immediately because the handwriting looked shakier than usual. Charles had already started feeling sick around that time, though neither of us knew the diagnosis yet. I opened it carefully. "Eleanor, if life ever becomes noisy around you, promise me you will trust actions more than words. Love reveals itself quietly. So does greed." I read the sentence twice, then a third time. My eyes drifted toward the window overlooking the backyard garden where Charles spent countless afternoons trimming roses while Vanessa sat nearby scrolling through luxury real estate listings on her phone. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now every memory felt rearranged somehow, as if someone had tilted the entire picture slightly sideways. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Nathan stepped hesitantly into the office. "Mom," his voice sounded tired. I slipped the card back into the envelope. "Yes." He leaned against the doorway awkwardly, hands buried in his pockets. "Vanessa found a really nice condo development near the harbor. It has security, Maintenance staff, elevators. A lot of retirees move there. There was that careful tone again. The one people use when trying to sell something they have already decided for you. I am not moving, I replied quietly. Nathan sighed heavily. Nobody is forcing you. Then stop bringing it up 2 days after your father's funeral. He looked down immediately. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to run into my bedroom during thunderstorms because he hated loud noises. Nathan was not cruel by nature. That almost made everything harder. Weakness can destroy families just as completely as cruelty can. Vanessa is only trying to plan ahead, he muttered finally. I studied my son carefully. Does she ever stop planning ahead? He did not answer. The silence between us stretched painfully through the room until his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen quickly. Vanessa, of course. I should take this, he said softly before stepping back into the hallway. I listened to his fading footsteps, then lowered my eyes toward Charles's desk once more. The office suddenly felt less like a room filled with memories and more like a room filled with warnings. And deep down, I could not shake the growing feeling that my husband had spent his final years quietly preparing for something he knew was eventually coming. 2 days later, the casseroles stopped arriving from church friends, the sympathy calls became less frequent, and the house settled into a quieter kind of loneliness. That is the strange thing about grief in America. People surround you generously at first with flowers, baked dishes, and soft voices, but eventually everyone returns to their own lives while yours remains frozen exactly where the loss happened. By Thursday afternoon, rain clouds had cleared and weak autumn sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows, illuminating dust particles drifting lazily above the countertops. I stood at the sink washing a coffee mug that still had Charles's initials engraved on the side when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. For a moment I considered ignoring it. Lately, every unexpected sound in the house made me tense. But when I opened the front door, I found Helen Parker standing on the porch in a camel-colored wool coat with a foil-covered pie balanced carefully in her hands. Helen and Charles had been friends since college. She was 71 now, sharp-eyed and elegant in the kind of effortless way that made aging look dignified instead of tragic. I figured somebody needed to bring you something that was not tuna casserole, she said dryly as she stepped inside. For the first time all week, I almost smiled. Helen walked slowly into the kitchen and set the pie on the counter before removing her gloves. Apple, she said. Store-bought because I refuse to pretend I still bake well. I poured coffee for both of us, and we sat quietly at the breakfast table while sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors. Unlike most visitors after the funeral, Helen did not fill the silence with meaningless comfort. She simply looked around the kitchen slowly, taking everything in. They have been here constantly, have they not? She finally asked. I paused with my coffee cup halfway to my lips. Nathan and Vanessa? Helen nodded once. Charles mentioned it before he passed. My fingers tightened slightly around the mug. Mention what exactly? Helen leaned back carefully in her chair. He was worried about you. A cold heaviness settled quietly in my chest. Why? She studied me for several seconds before answering. Because he believed Vanessa was already making plans for this house long before he died. The kitchen suddenly felt very still. Even the ticking clock near the pantry seemed louder somehow. Charles never told me that. I whispered. Of course he did not, Helen replied softly. He loved Nathan too much to create conflict. While he was sick, I stared out the window toward the backyard garden where fallen leaves covered the stone pathway Charles built by hand years earlier. What exactly did he say? Helen sighed lightly and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. About 6 months ago, Vanessa asked me whether I knew any high-end realtors in Fairfield County. My eyes lifted toward her immediately. 6 months ago? Helen nodded. She said she was helping a family member explore investment properties, but she kept asking questions about your neighborhood specifically. Your lot size, market value, renovation potential. My stomach tightened slowly. Charles had still been alive 6 months ago. Still sitting in his garden every morning wrapped in his brown cardigan while drinking tea and reading the newspaper. There is more, Helen added quietly. A few weeks before Charles passed, he called me late one night. I listened carefully now, every nerve suddenly alert. He sounded exhausted, she continued. Not physically, emotionally. He told me he overheard Vanessa pressuring Nathan about the house after one of your doctor appointments. My throat felt dry. Pressuring him how? Helen's expression darkened slightly. She said it made no financial sense for so much equity to remain tied up in a property occupied by one elderly woman. Elderly woman. Not mother. Not family. Just a financial inconvenience waiting to be solved. I looked down at the table and realized my hands were trembling slightly for the first time since the funeral. Helen reached across quietly and touched my wrist. "Eleanor," she said gently. Charles knew exactly what she was. I closed my eyes briefly. Then why did he leave me alone in this? Helen's face softened immediately. He did not. I opened my eyes again. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering immediately, Helen reached into her handbag and removed a small cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in Charles's handwriting. My breath caught instantly. "He gave me this 3 months ago," she said softly. "He told me to wait until after the funeral unless something happened sooner." The room suddenly felt smaller around me. I stared at the envelope without touching it. Charles's handwriting looked steady, familiar, alive somehow. "What is it?" I whispered. Helen shook her head slowly. "I never opened it. But he made me promise something." "What?" Her eyes met mine carefully across the kitchen table. "He said if the time ever came, you would finally understand why he never truly trusted Vanessa." After Helen left that afternoon, I remained alone at the kitchen table for nearly an hour with Charles's envelope resting untouched beside my coffee cup. Outside, the sky had turned pale gray again, and cold wind rattled the branches behind the house hard enough to scatter leaves across the patio stones. I kept staring at my name written in his careful handwriting. Eleanor. The same way he had addressed every birthday card, every anniversary letter, every note he ever tucked beside my purse before business trips. Familiar. Steady. Safe. My fingers finally slid beneath the envelope flap slowly, almost reverently. Inside was a single folded sheet of cream-colored paper and a business card attached with a silver paper clip. Gregory Sloan, attorney at law. My pulse slowed immediately at the sight of the name. Gregory had handled several legal matters for Charles over the years, though I had not spoken to him directly in almost a decade. Beneath the card was Charles's letter. "If you are reading this, it means I was right to worry. Eleanor, there are conversations I chose not to burden you with while I was alive because I wanted our remaining years together to feel peaceful. But peace does not erase truth. I believe Vanessa has been quietly preparing to separate you from this house for a long time, and Nathan is too weak to stop her. Do not sign anything. Do not move anywhere. And most importantly, do not let guilt make decisions for you. Gregory knows everything. Trust him." I read the letter twice before setting it down carefully on the table. There was no anger in Charles's words. No bitterness. Only certainty. That frightened me more than anything else. Suddenly, every uneasy glance he exchanged with Vanessa over the years returned to me with painful clarity. Every moment I dismissed as suspicion now felt deliberate, thoughtful, protective. The sound of the front door opening interrupted my thoughts. Nathan and Vanessa had returned from another mysterious afternoon meeting. Their voices drifted faintly through the hallway before Vanessa entered the kitchen carrying shopping bags from an upscale grocery store nearby. "Oh, good," she said brightly when she saw me sitting there. "You finally ate something." I folded Charles's letter calmly and slipped it back inside the envelope before she could see it. Nathan loosened his coat near the doorway and glanced at me cautiously. "How was your afternoon, Mom?" "Quiet," I answered simply. Vanessa began unpacking groceries onto the counter with polished efficiency. Imported sparkling water, organic produce, fresh flowers. She moved through my kitchen like she already belonged there. "Nathan and I were thinking maybe we should all have dinner together tonight," she said lightly. "It might be good for everyone." Good for everyone. Another carefully chosen phrase. I nodded once. "That sounds fine." Around 7 o'clock, we sat at the dining room table beneath the chandelier Charles installed himself after insisting the old fixture looked like something from a motel lobby. Candlelight reflected softly against the crystal glasses while rain tapped gently against the windows overlooking the dark backyard. Vanessa served roasted chicken and wild rice onto our plates with the calm confidence of someone hosting an event instead of visiting a grieving widow. Nathan barely touched his food. He looked exhausted again, shadows dark beneath his eyes. "I spoke with a financial advisor today," Vanessa said casually halfway through dinner. "There are some really excellent retirement communities near the shoreline now. Full medical support, private dining, social activities." I cut my chicken slowly without looking up. I am not interested in retirement communities. Vanessa smiled politely. Of course not immediately. We are just exploring options for the future. My future seems to be discussed quite often lately. The room went quiet for a moment. Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Vanessa took a small sip of wine before responding. Eleanor, nobody wants you to feel pushed. Then stop pushing. My voice remained calm. That seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. Vanessa set her fork down carefully beside her plate. You are misunderstanding our intentions. Am I? I finally lifted my eyes toward her. Because from where I am sitting, it appears everyone became very concerned about my living arrangements before your father-in-law had even been buried for 24 hours. Nathan looked down immediately. Vanessa's smile faded slightly around the edges. That is unfair, she said softly. Nathan and I are trying to help protect you. Protect me. The same word she used when changing the alarm code without asking. I reached for my water glass calmly. Charles protected me for 41 years. I replied quietly. He never once treated me like a problem to solve. Silence settled heavily over the table after that. Outside, wind brushed softly against the windows. Somewhere upstairs, the old radiator pipes hummed faintly through the walls. Vanessa looked toward Nathan, clearly waiting for him to speak. He swallowed hard before finally lifting his eyes toward me. Mom, he said carefully. Maybe this house just carries too many memories now. I stared at my son for several seconds. Then I looked around the dining room, where every inch of that house contained memories he could not even begin to understand. Birthday dinners, Christmas mornings, school science projects spread across the table. Charles dancing with me barefoot in the kitchen one snowy December night after too much wine. Memories, I said quietly, are the only reason this place still feels alive. Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair, watching me with narrowed eyes now. Not emotional. Calculating. Measuring something. And for the first time since Charles died, I realized something else very clearly. She was beginning to understand that I was not going to disappear as easily as she expected. The following morning, I woke earlier than usual and dressed carefully before sunrise. Not because I had plans, but because something inside me no longer wanted to sit quietly waiting for other people to decide my future. I chose a navy sweater Charles always liked and brushed my silver hair slowly in front of the bedroom mirror while pale morning light crept across the walls. For the first time since the funeral, I noticed the woman staring back at me did not look broken. Tired, yes. Grieving, certainly. But not broken. Downstairs, the house remained silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of old pipes behind the walls. Vanessa and Nathan had stayed overnight in the guest room again. Another detail that no longer felt accidental. They were not visiting. They were positioning themselves. I brewed coffee and carried Charles's letter into the den where the large windows overlooked the backyard garden now buried beneath drifting orange leaves. Gregory Sloane's business card rested beside my cup. I stared at it for nearly 5 minutes before finally picking up the phone. Gregory answered on the second ring. Mrs. Whitmore. His voice sounded calm, almost unsurprised. I have been expecting your call. A chill moved slowly through me. You knew Charles left me that letter? Yes. He paused briefly. Your husband was a very thorough man. We arranged to meet later that afternoon at his office in downtown Stamford. I did not tell Nathan or Vanessa where I was going. Around noon, Vanessa appeared in the kitchen wearing dark sunglasses and carrying her car keys. I have a meeting with the realtor, she said casually while checking something on her phone. Realtor. She no longer even tried hiding it. That sounds productive, I replied quietly. She studied me carefully over the top edge of her glasses, as though trying to decide whether I knew more than I should. Nathan mentioned you seemed upset during dinner last night, she said gently. I hope you understand we are only trying to help make things easier for you. Easier. The word had started sounding dangerous. I smiled faintly. I am beginning to realize people often use that word right before taking something. For a split second, her expression hardened before smoothing itself again. You are under a lot of emotional stress, she said softly. Sometimes grief can make people suspicious. I looked directly at her then. And sometimes suspicion arrives because grief finally removes distraction. Neither of us spoke after that. Vanessa picked up her handbag and left the house a few moments later without another word. By 2 o'clock, I was sitting across from Gregory Sloane inside a quiet corner office overlooking Stamford Harbor. Rain clouds hovered low above the water, while sailboats rocked gently against their slips below. Gregory looked older than I remembered, his gray hair thinner now, his glasses resting low against his nose, but his eyes remained sharp. He folded his hands carefully across the desk. Charles was worried this moment might come sooner than you expected. How long had he been planning? I asked quietly. Gregory opened a thick leather folder in front of him. About a year after his cancer diagnosis. The words settled heavily into the room. I stared at the documents spread neatly across the desk. Trust agreements, property records, legal amendments. Charles had prepared everything carefully, methodically. He believed Vanessa was manipulating Nathan financially. Gregory continued calmly. More importantly, he believed they intended to pressure you into selling the house after his passing. I lowered my eyes slowly toward the papers. Even hearing it spoken aloud did not shock me anymore. Somehow that frightened me most of all. Gregory slid one document gently across the desk toward me. Your husband established an irrevocable trust 6 months ago. My eyes moved across the legal language carefully. Then I froze. What is this? Gregory removed his glasses slowly. The house legally belongs to the trust now, not directly to Nathan. I looked up immediately. Nathan does not inherit it. Not unless specific conditions are met. My pulse slowed into something cold and steady. What conditions? Gregory's expression remained unreadable. You retain full residential rights for the remainder of your life. Additionally, Charles included a behavioral clause. Behavioral clause? Gregory nodded once. If any beneficiary attempts to coerce, manipulate, or pressure you into surrendering residence, property access, or financial control, they immediately forfeit their inheritance rights under the trust. Silence filled the office completely. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows overlooking the harbor. I stared down at the document again while my heartbeat echoed quietly in my ears. Charles knew. Not suspected. Knew. Gregory leaned back slightly in his chair. Your husband loved Nathan very much, he said carefully. But he believed weakness can become dangerous when paired with ambition. I closed my eyes briefly. Every conversation from the past week suddenly rearranged itself in my mind. The alarm code, the real estate brochures, the retirement communities. Vanessa discussing timing for the listing before Charles was even buried. They had already triggered the very clause designed to stop them. Gregory folded his hands together again. There is more, he said quietly. But before we continue, you need to decide something first. I lifted my eyes toward him slowly. What? His voice lowered slightly. Do you want to protect your family from the truth? He paused for one long second. Or do you want the truth to protect you? When I returned home from Gregory Sloane's office that evening, the house no longer felt like a place I was losing. It felt like a place Charles had quietly defended long before I realized there was a war around me. The late afternoon sky had darkened into deep shades of blue and gray, and soft rain streaked across the front windows as I stepped into the foyer. I removed my coat slowly and noticed voices drifting from the dining room. Vanessa and Nathan were already there, waiting. The moment I entered, Vanessa stood from her chair with polished concern written across her face. Eleanor, she said gently, we were starting to worry. Worry. Another carefully selected word. I placed my purse calmly on the entry table beneath Charles's portrait before walking into the dining room. A stack of papers sat neatly arranged beside Vanessa's wine glass. Real estate documents again. Property estimates. Floor plans for condominiums near the harbor. Nathan looked pale and restless, tapping his fingers anxiously against the table. Where were you? He asked quietly. I pulled out my chair and sat down slowly. Meeting with Gregory Sloane. The effect was immediate. Vanessa's expression tightened almost invisibly around the eyes. Nathan froze completely. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the grandfather clock near the staircase marked each second loudly through the silence. Finally, Vanessa smiled again, though this time it looked thinner somehow. I did not realize Gregory was still handling Charles's affairs, she said carefully. Apparently, he handled more than I realized too. I kept my voice calm. That seemed to unsettle her most of all. Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mom, nobody is trying to pressure you. I looked directly at him. That is interesting, because according to Gregory, pressure appears to have become a recurring topic lately. Vanessa straightened slightly beside him. What exactly is that supposed to mean? I folded my hands neatly together on the table. It means Charles anticipated certain conversations before he died. The room went still. Even the air itself seemed heavier suddenly. Vanessa forced out a small laugh. Eleanor, I think grief is making this situation unnecessarily dramatic. Dramatic. The same word she used at the funeral when discussing inheritance beside my husband's coffin. I studied her quietly for a moment. Perfect makeup, perfect posture, perfect composure. Vanessa always believed control came from appearing calmest in the room. What she never understood was that truly dangerous people rarely need to raise their voices. Charles established legal protections before his death, I said softly. Nathan's eyes lifted toward me immediately. Protections? I nodded once. For me. For this house. Vanessa's expression finally changed then. Not panic. Something colder. Calculation accelerating behind her eyes. What kind of protections? She asked carefully. I watched her for another second before answering. The kind designed specifically to prevent manipulation. Silence crashed heavily across the table. Nathan looked between us nervously. Mom, nobody is manipulating you. Really? My voice remained almost gentle. Because changing alarm codes, contacting realtors before the funeral flowers even wilted, and discussing retirement facilities behind my back certainly creates a different impression. Nathan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Vanessa leaned forward slightly now, all traces of warmth disappearing from her face. You are twisting things. No, I replied quietly. I am finally seeing them clearly. Rain continued sliding down the windows in slow, uneven trails while the chandelier above the dining room cast soft gold light across the table. For a long moment nobody moved. Then Nathan spoke again, his voice strained. What exactly did Gregory tell you? I held his gaze steadily. Enough. Vanessa immediately stood from her chair and walked toward the kitchen island, arms folded tightly across her chest. This is unbelievable, she muttered. After everything we have done for you. I almost smiled at that. Everything we have done for you. Not with you. Not for Charles. Always transactional. Always measured. You know, I said quietly. Charles once told me that greed reveals itself fastest when people think they are entitled to something they have not earned. Vanessa turned sharply toward me. Are you accusing us of something? I am not accusing anyone, I answered calmly. I am simply listening very carefully now. Nathan rubbed both hands across his face in frustration. Can we please stop talking like this? Poor Nathan. He still believed silence could prevent consequences. No, I said softly. I do not think we can anymore. Another long silence settled over the room. Then my son finally asked the question he had been afraid to say aloud all evening. What happens to the house? I looked toward Charles's portrait visible from the dining room doorway. The soft hallway light reflected gently against the glass covering his photograph. Even now, he looked steady, certain, prepared. That, I replied quietly, depends entirely on whether Charles's final instructions were respected. Vanessa's face lost color instantly. Just for a second. Barely noticeable. But I saw it. And in that moment, I understood something very clearly. She already knew exactly what those instructions probably were. 3 days later, we sat inside Gregory Sloane's conference room beneath soft recessed lighting while rain drifted steadily across the harbor windows behind him. The city skyline looked pale and distant through the gray afternoon fog, and the polished walnut table reflected the strained expressions sitting around it. Vanessa arrived wearing a cream-colored designer coat and pearl earrings, carrying herself with the same controlled elegance she used at charity galas and corporate dinners. Nathan looked exhausted beside her, his shoulders tense, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. I wore black again, not because I wanted to mourn publicly anymore, but because grief still felt too close to my skin to dress any differently. Gregory sat quietly at the head of the table reviewing several documents while the clock on the wall ticked softly through the silence. Vanessa finally folded her hands together and smiled politely. I assume we are here to finalize Charles's estate arrangements. Finalize. Such a clean word for dismantling someone's life. Gregory removed his glasses calmly. We are here to review the trust conditions established by Charles Whitmore approximately 6 months before his passing. Nathan shifted uneasily beside his wife. Vanessa remained perfectly still. Gregory opened the first folder carefully. Mr. Whitmore transferred all residential property holdings, including the family home, into an irrevocable trust intended solely for the protection and lifetime benefit of Eleanor Whitmore. Vanessa blinked once. Slowly. "I see," she said evenly. Gregory continued without looking up. "The trust further specifies that Eleanor Whitmore retains permanent residential authority and exclusive occupancy rights for the duration of her lifetime." Nathan frowned immediately. "Permanent?" Gregory nodded once. "Correct." Silence settled heavily across the room. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass while boats rocked gently below in the marina. Vanessa finally leaned forward slightly. "And after Eleanor passes?" Gregory lifted another document from the folder. "That depends entirely upon compliance with the behavioral clauses outlined by Mr. Whitmore." The room became very still after that sentence. Even Nathan seemed to stop breathing for a moment. Gregory's voice remained calm and professional. "Any beneficiary found attempting coercion, intimidation, manipulation, or pressure regarding property surrender, financial control, or residential displacement immediately forfeits all inheritance rights connected to the trust." Nathan stared at Gregory in disbelief. Vanessa's expression remained controlled, but I noticed the slight tightening around her mouth now. Tiny cracks finally beginning to appear. "That language seems extremely subjective," she replied carefully. Gregory folded his hands together. "Not particularly." He opened another file. Mr. Whitmore anticipated potential disputes and requested extensive documentation standards. My pulse slowed into complete stillness. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. "Documentation?" Gregory nodded. "Recorded witness statements. Timeline notes. Multiple corroborating accounts." He paused briefly before adding, "Including statements concerning discussions of property liquidation prior to funeral proceedings." Nathan turned sharply toward Vanessa then. Just for a second. Long enough for me to see fear finally enter the room. Real fear. Gregory calmly slid several papers across the table toward them. There are also references to unauthorized alarm code changes, real estate consultations conducted before bereavement periods concluded, and repeated efforts to encourage residential relocation. Vanessa's face lost color immediately now. Not dramatically, just enough. The kind of change only people watching carefully would notice. "This is ridiculous," she said quietly. "We were trying to help Eleanor." Gregory looked directly at her for the first time. Intent becomes difficult to defend when financial urgency repeatedly appears in private conversations. Nathan lowered his eyes toward the table. His wedding band turned slowly against his finger. I almost felt sorry for him then. Almost. Gregory removed one final document from the folder. "Based upon the evidence currently available, Charles Whitmore's trust conditions have already been violated." The words landed softly, calmly, yet somehow they shattered the room anyway. Nathan looked up immediately. "What does that mean?" Gregory's voice never changed. "It means both of you have forfeited all future inheritance rights connected to the residential trust." Silence followed, deep and absolute. Vanessa stared at Gregory without moving while rain continued sliding slowly down the windows behind him. Nathan looked physically smaller somehow, like the air had gone out of him all at once. "There must be some mistake," he whispered. Gregory simply closed the folder. "There is no mistake." Vanessa finally stood abruptly from her chair, composure cracking at last. "Charles manipulated this entire situation against us." I looked at her quietly across the table. "No," I said softly. "Charles protected me from a situation he already understood." Her eyes snapped toward mine instantly. Angry now. Cornered. But underneath the anger, I saw something else for the first time since I met her. Panic. Nathan rubbed both hands across his face slowly. "Mom," he whispered hoarsely, "you are really going to let this happen?" I studied my son carefully. The little boy who once cried when he accidentally stepped on a bird's nest. The teenager who hated confrontation so deeply he apologized even when he was right. Somewhere along the way, weakness became permission for someone else's ambition. "I am not letting anything happen," I answered quietly. "Your father already made his decision." Nobody spoke after that. Gregory gathered the documents neatly back into the folders while thunder rolled faintly over the harbor outside. Vanessa stared toward the windows with cold disbelief frozen across her face. Nathan looked broken. And strangely, sitting there beneath the soft office lights while Charles's final instructions unfolded exactly as he intended, I no longer felt abandoned. I finally understood the last thing my husband ever gave me was not money, or property, or protection. It was clarity.